Let's move to the discussion part. And I have one question to Mohammed. So and John. So this care team label looks like it should be assigned on FHIR. Yeah. So I could not interpret it. So if we like the security label care team, that means that you should be in care team to see this data. How you expect that it should work? I mean, how server has to behave. So let's say, okay, I'm doctor who is requesting data and I'm part of the care team for this specific patient, and I'm not a part of care team for different patient.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the tag you're speaking of.
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, quite literally, there are some vocabulary terms in the HCS that are quite, a mystery to me. They were put in there, long time ago and whatever. So, yeah, the codes are not all that well managed yet.
Yeah, because for me, it looks like it should be dynamically calculated based on context. So if the provider in the care team, then it has this tag.
Yeah.
It's not, and it's kind of technically hard to implement. So.
Right. I'm not familiar with this code either, but my kind of off the top of my head understanding is that the idea was to restrict the visibility of the data, like for the recipient. So you receive this data, but you only make it available to the immediate care team of the patient and not broader.
Yeah.
So that is what I understand from it, and the application of what that means, who is in the care team or not, is on the recipient's access control system.
Yeah, there's certainly the concept of this data is only available to care. There is that concept, and in fact, I kind of learned of this concept probably a dozen years ago with the NHS looking to define a service called legitimate relationship, which was a service they were proposing that the access control could call based on the user who is requesting data. Does this user have a legitimate relationship to this patient? And that was supposed to cover things like whether ADT had tagged this clinician as part of the care team. It was interesting they ended up killing that because ADT was happening too fast for the service to keep up, and therefore it the computing wasn't available at the time. But I think I certainly have seen the concept, but I haven't seen a security tag.
Yeah, thank you. Anshu, one small question. Yeah. So what the right approach? It is quite common scenario to say, so the policy that the provider can see the data of the patient, which this provider related to through care team or somehow else, yes? So what are recommendations to describe it in FHIR? So how it should work? I mean, in a generic FHIR way, do we have tools to describe this or not yet? So, and it's out of scope.
I think if you were to look at the FHIR list of resources, care team resource itself could theoretically do that, but that would mean you would have at least a care team resource for every patient. And this starts to, question the scalability of that solution. So, a hierarchy of care teams, I don't know that I haven't seen any particular good answer to that question.
Anshu, so.
Yeah. Thank you. So similar to this question, I am also kind of introspecting, deliberating within my team, how to implement security label for care team, wherein somebody working on behalf of a provider to restrict certain data element to show if the person logs in as on the behalf of the provider, not show everything. So probably that data element on behalf of could be the answer, but just if you can throw some light on this scenario.
Using the care team as a security mechanism is a great thought. It seems like the care team is more supporting conditions. That's at least my opinion. I spent about a decade in the payer system, and we struggle with the same thing. We wound up putting in a lot of custom security around at the application level and then, either the admin of the provider side or the admin of the payer side had to, do their security forms to fix that. That's how we solved it for, tactically for how to make sure that they had access within the app. I don't know about others, but that was my experience.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. John, do you want to add to answer something?
No, I think this is one of these where the default today is treatment, does this user have a treatment role? Yep, good, they're in, which of course, comes to head immediately when you get with VIP patients. So, with VIP patients, you then have this relationship of the VIP security tag on that patient, and whether the clinician, has a VIP relevant permission. So I think I just don't know that there's a clean way to deal with it. And I think the other piece, and maybe this was also what Mark was kind of getting at, is it's such a fluid thing, the I am helping this clinician out because I was, he pulled me as I walked past in the hall, that's not going to even be known by ADT, to go back to this NHS legitimate relationship service that just couldn't keep up because ADT was overwhelming it. Yeah.
We're looking at this in the provider access API because that's driven by, it's relatively simple. It's on the payer side, but it's looking at basically the attribution list, which you can derive an existing treatment relationship by, for example, looking at claims history and seeing, yes, this practitioner's worked with this patient. We've got to factor in from the patient. But what we're also looking at is with the prior authorization, there's a bunch of hooks. And could some of those hooks, like encounter start or even appointment book, be an input to some sort of real-time attribution list maintenance process where effectively the group resource is the attribution list that defines everyone that the practitioner or particular individual has access to.
Something like a legitimate relationship service that returns, a 1, 2, 3 kind of evaluation. Then you don't have to say that this is the data layout that service derived a direct relationship or an indirect relationship from, but that allows it to spelunk through whatever data it needs to, even if that means it's spelunking through proprietary databases and in addition to the FHIR data. I just don't know that in FHIR there's a clean resource that covers the space. That's all my point is.
Longer route, what I was thinking is, like, see, Epic provides if you build an application, Epic provides patient category application, then they merge provider/care admin, or I don't remember the term now. They ask you what kind of application is that, right? So I was thinking, if the care team or admin has to access, shall we bring another different application and address it that way to have different level of data access, right? So I was thinking from that way, if that solves. But thank you.
Yeah, I have a topic to discuss. So let's say we have data exchange working between all organizations, and how should consent follow the data somehow? Because, I'm organization A, I'm sharing data to organization B. So the data moving from A to B, should the consent or some security consideration walk with the data to different location and then be applied there? And another problem, it's terrible, but can I revoke the success later if I decided eventually that I don't want for this system to have access to my data? Or in case of TEFCA, yes, if like multiple systems get access to my data, I need some operation to revoke access.
Yeah, I think this is a really good principle, right? People should be able to decide where their data goes, and then if you make a mistake, you should be able to change your mind later, at least for the good guys, right? It's never going to be the case that you can tell the bad guys to stop using your data in illegal ways. That's not a policy level decision. But, I'll say practically, one way to get a little bit more of this behavior in systems is to do more with data on a transient basis. So rather than expecting that somebody's going to grab all your data, use it for one purpose today, and then keep it forever, and also follow your rules and keep following your rules, you might move more towards operations where you make your data available on the basis that you're going to use it right now and delete it. And you can come by again automatically tomorrow if you need it again. But then there's sort of more one source of truth that people have to keep coming back to. And we may see more and more services that will bundle compute with the data. So, there are some use cases where I don't need your whole clinical history. I just want to compute this risk score. And the fact is, nobody will compute it for me. I've got to do it myself. So the only way is to first get all the data, but you could imagine, more services being offered that bring the compute closer to those data.
Yeah. And I know from a consent side that the Karen Alliance is working on some of the consent piece around the patient itself. That's come up as an issue for us to tackle. So I think and Josh, I think you were there too when they were talking about it. So I'm expecting there to be something that comes out of that conversation.
You can do that kind of a thing where it's like, okay, the consent just changed and now everybody sees that new consent. Historically, that's been a very difficult thing to do. And it's related to, I think the big point here is we are dominantly watching treatment-based workflows for which so much of what we would like to put into consent rules just simply doesn't apply. Payment, at least there are some kinds of cases where payment can have these kinds of interactions. You get into operations, you get into research, you get into, these other things that become far more. One, to Josh's point, I would love to see that kind of a thing. Again, I think in a treatment use case, it falls apart because if I have made a treatment decision and I'm instantiating that as a decision, I have to hang on to the evidence. But if I move away from that, then absolutely, competing a risk score. There are obligation codes that can easily be applied at the bundle level to say, hey, I'm releasing this data to you. I have the authorization to release it to you. All of your stuff checks out, but I am going to include the obligation that you cannot persist it. So in theory, I have that ability today. Now, I clearly wouldn't want to tag a bundle with don't persist if I didn't think that you won't follow that and not persist. But there are some of those obligations codes that are available for these kinds of things, like don't persist, or if you persist, encrypt it, or if you persist, a further consent is necessary to do anything else with it. So there are those kinds of obligation codes. And then on the little bit more complex side, we're working on, in the HL7 security space, we're working on adding a permission resource. And one of the prime use cases that interests me with the permission resource is I could attach the permission resource at the bundle level and say things more complex than do not persist. Like I could say, it's okay for you to hang on to this for 7 days, but then you have to discard. So I can put in conditions in there. I can put in variables, those kinds of things in the permission. Again, it doesn't help to just attach this to a bundle if you don't know that the recipient of that bundle is going to look at it and abide by it. But having the ability to communicate those obligations or those permissions, those restrictions, is kind of what we're trying to add with the permission. I think a lot of proof will be in the pudding there. It's awfully academic at this point. We are working through some use case analysis rather than just simply putting it out there as theory.
Thank you. Any other topics? Josh, maybe let's discuss this like patient in the middle idea for exchange. I think if I would be the patient, I would love to know what's going on with my data and participate in.
Yeah, I mean, it works both ways, right? Like there's obviously scenarios where if you were the patient who had just been in a ski accident and you're unconscious and somebody takes you to the emergency room and, your phone was destroyed when you hit a tree, like you still want the care team to be able to figure out what medications you need to be on. And I think, most everyone sort of agrees with that perspective. So the trick is figuring out how to allow patients to be in the middle of these sharing loops for the vast majority of scenarios where that makes sense and, not totally break the system where you need it in emergency cases. So John pointed to things like break the glass and, that's sort of a reasonable domain if you can make the use of it small enough that it can be meaningfully audited after the fact. But if your everyday sharing pattern is one that involves just sort of trust by authority, you can't really audit that very well. Or at least I don't see evidence that it's being audited very well. These QHINs go through the network to look up a patient versus being able to connect directly to a healthcare system that has data about the patient. Today, the only data flow that's actually working in TEFCA is one where you go through the QHIN, the Health Information Network, and they kind of broker the connection to individual care sites. They manage the lookup functionality and route your messages back and forth. In that scenario, they've got a pretty good ability to at least create audit logs, and they're required to create audit logs, but they're not required to share them with patients. So for me, like that's like the number one smallest step that we could take is these large organizations, there's only like on the order of 10 of them, it's even fewer than that are already maintaining these kinds of logs. They should have some responsibility to share them back with patients. That has been really tough because those organizations are already perfectly busy and have a lot of other responsibilities on their plate. They don't have any patient-facing infrastructure at all. They're pure backend stuff. So they say, well, it doesn't make sense for us to offer this service. Maybe. So anyway, that's the narrowest thing that I think could help. But then we get into this world of point-to-point sharing, where, TEFCA member over there, they want to talk to each other about a patient, but they don't need to go through the QHIN if they're just writing FHIR queries. Now, FHIR exchange is not yet happening in TEFCA, so I'm just describing how people expect it will work. But what people expect is that point-to-point connection will happen without any involvement from the QHIN, and so it's not clear sort of where the audit logs would go. Now, again, one straightforward idea in my mind would be you can still impose audit logging requirements and make the QHINs responsible for them. You could say, if you're going to share data about a patient under TEFCA, even if it's part of a point-to-point transaction, you could still send an audit notification to your QHIN. And that way you've got a complete record somewhere. Again, this idea is not at all popular. I really can't quite see a way to bring this into reality, but to my mind, it really would help go a long way towards solving that transparency problem.
Amen.
So what do we do about that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe even not restricting information, but at least know what's going on. Yeah, and who is using your information.
So I do see, like within my personal health portal, which is Epic, there is a log of accesses to my data, but
yeah,
it completely falls to pieces when you start getting external bodies involved. And of course, I can't really know to what extent it's depth. I think one of the problems is that to get exhaustive is to overwhelm. And I think there's a concern about overwhelming, for which my response is, yeah, if you can overwhelm the patients with too much logging, that just creates an app space opportunity for an audit app that watches your logs and looks for unusual behaviors, because yes, you've been to this doctor 12 times. You didn't need to know that, he saw your data again today. So I think if we can open the floodgates, we create an opportunity. But I agree with you. I don't see the motivation to open the floodgates yet. It's expense. There's no benefit. There's a drawback, because then the patient can say, oh, hey, who is this practitioner 1, 2, 3, 4? And now they have, phone calls that are asking about information that they really, don't want to answer.
Yeah, I think there needs to be some agreement on the principle, and it needs to sort of make its way into the formal charter of these networks in order to have a chance of actually happening. It's not something that's that easy to bolt on to an existing exchange system. Technically feasible, but getting people to come along for that journey is tough.
Yeah. Now, on the topic within IHE, I do have the basic audit log patterns implementation guide, which defines for the RESTful operations, how would you log those? And if you logged those, how would a client have access to them? It's very, rudimentary, but it's been implemented by a couple of different FHIR servers. So it's an opportunity, again, if you open the floodgates, applications will come along and start adding analytics to this data feed and going, okay, I don't want to overwhelm the patient with all this, but oh, by the way, here's an unusual thing.
Thank you. Any other topics to discuss, guys? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. Josh, any way for security labels to be incorporated into Smart on FHIR, or it's enough security parameter will work?
So we had a lot of discussion about this in the original Argonaut project when we were designing the granular scope language. And there is a slot for saying this. So to the extent that an underlying EHR knows about security labels and can enforce them, you can include them in your smart scopes. So you can say, I want all observations with a security label of X, or with a confidentiality label that ranges from low to medium but not extreme, right? There's a few different classification systems. The challenge has been, even though we can express these labels in our scopes, that doesn't mean that real world systems will be able to enforce them correctly. So we've been really reluctant to try to suggest or require that until we see some evidence that systems are able to enforce. Even getting these category level enforcements is taking time.
And one of the challenges I grappled with when I was trying to do this using FHIR queries, basically, to be able to actually apply to smart scopes, is that you kind of hit a wall with the FHIR query limitations. At least the kind of FHIR queries that you can do inline as a get query, like there is a more advanced query language that you could use, but that's not something in the smart scopes. So if you want to have something complicated that would lead to like an and an or with security labels, then it's not going to be easily expressible.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, guys. Any other topic? Everybody a little bit tight, yes. And it is interesting discussion about like operations and data, kind of two point of views, how to describe this. It remind me like functions and data, where the logic should live, like in data structures or in the functions, wrap it in an object. So do you think, Josh, you will choose one of them, or you will kind of try to use both of these ideas? Like,
I think we'll do a little bit of both is my best guess. I think there's going to be some use cases that are pretty well served by just being able to describe the data structures and the sort of read versus write. And for everything that's in that bucket, it's much cleaner. It's going to be easier to consistently represent those scopes. You can easily compute the overlaps. You can take unions and intersections. There's a lot of benefits to describing things by the data. But we've already heard there are plenty of use cases where we just have this operation or this whole set of capabilities, and we want to handle a name for that whole thing. And that's, in your analogy, that's like functions. So I think we want to at least be able to assign names to those functions. It might be that all we do in the Smart IG is say servers can use operation definition URLs and capability statement URLs if they want to point to those things as a set. So my guess is that we'll do both of those.
Because to be honest, when we were developing like HRs and some APIs, so we call it like safe operations. So you can always design safe operation, which probably may use different resources and quite sensitive, but you can hide all this logic behind the operation and just say, okay, you can call this operation, it's quite safe, you could not do anything bad with this operation, but you don't have direct access to the data which is used in this operation.
The only thing that I would like to ask you is out path of the request.
Okay, so that's some technical requirement.
It's breaking the HTTP.
Oh, you mean that they could be very long and you may hit limitation?
Not only, but especially when you're requesting, for example, patient.rf. Josh suggested to use read and set, but actually this is some sort of extension that means that file extension. By the way, it's
so those were only appear
assumes requested kind of request is already have some sort of, I don't know. This is file extension.
Yeah, so there may be some confusion about those scopes. They don't appear in a URL path. They appear either in a query parameter in an authorization request or in a JSON payload. So you're never like navigating to myserver.com/patient.rs with those scopes.
Okay, so that's small confusion. Yeah, and John, I have a question about permission resource. What is this? So is it kind of policy? So it's going to express the policy, and is it going to be machine readable? So can I put any logic into permission resource?
That's the vision. We're not quite there, but yeah, the theory is that permission should be able to cover all policy space that's not consent, and we even have the ability to have consent say, hey, my rules are in that permission. But yeah, permission is supposed to be a general purpose policy where we're trying desperately not to reinvent the wheel because there are policy languages out there. XOCML keeps coming up, ODRL keeps coming up. There's a bunch of these policy. So we're trying not to go off the deep end and reinvent that. But there is a benefit to having a FHIR encoding for some things that are very FHIR specific. So being able to point at FHIR resources or being able to use, the FHIR data types. But yeah, one theory is that it could your whole policy, your overriding policy is the term we're using, could be completely rewritten in a permission resource, and then you just point at that permission resource to say that's our base policy. And we're doing those kinds of use case analysis in a subwork group. Based on that, we either propose changes to the permission resource or bring examples from that into the permission resource. But right now we're just kind of using the IG publishing tool as a way to do use case analysis, not to write an IG, but as a way to do use case analysis.
Thank you. Is technically consent policy as well or not? Just philosophical question.
Yeah, well, that became one of the problems, right? As soon as we said, hey, permission can do any policy, they were like, well, why do we have the consent resource anymore? And the primary reason to have the consent resource is that it is specific to patient and it's specific to the ceremony of capturing the consent. So like I said, the permission has a set of rules within the permission. You could say, hey, I don't want to have two different ways to encode policy rules. So I'll use the consent resource to capture the ceremony, but the rules would be in a permission resource. So you'd have an instance of a permission resource that has the rules, and then the consent resource just points at that permission for the sub rules. So we do have that ability, but right now, yeah, we're unfortunately, we've got two different ways to do.
John, I'm just thinking whether probably we need to have value of an obligation resource. How do we deal with obligations which provide additional thing in addition to permissions for consent? Because consent is about patient, but also it provides obligations for some of the providers to fulfill the choices of a patient. So
yeah,
I feel
an obligation is indeed a policy, right? So some of the use cases that I've worked up for how do I use permission is, for example, to say, hey, you asked for data. Here is a bundle of the data that met the query you asked for. But by the way, I'm going to impose upon you an obligation to not use it for this, go ahead and use it for that, discard it after this amount of time. So you would encode that into a permission and attach that to the bundle so that the recipient would know the conditions under which they can use the information. So it's a more advanced obligation than the obligation vocabulary supports. So obligation vocabulary does support things like don't print, don't persist. You must get an additional consent, but it doesn't have the ability to say all three of those combined. So permission would be kind of that wrapper in that case. So that's one of the use cases for permission, in addition to the overriding policy of an organization. Another use case, which is protecting the branches and leaves in a provider directory, so it's provider directory specific. So we've got a bunch of different use cases that we're working through.
Right. But I was just thinking, if you're talking about a generic permission, then there is a scope to talk about generic obligations as per even deontic logic, where obligations is statement that someone is obliged to do particular behavior, not necessarily consent, but something that you need to monitor in terms of tracking and things like that. So if you're talking about generic permission, I'd probably like to add a little bit more thoughts into obligations. And I think the work which we did with Mohammed, I remember it was HL7 consent service management. We did bring in the issue about obligations, permissions, prohibitions as coming from the logic perspective, and then informing how we can implement that in a system as a part of tokens, even that you can share among participants.
Yeah.
Anyway, just a thought.
No, I want to say it's in scope. We have to pick a resource name, and invariably that resource name doesn't work for some things, right? I mean, many people have complained that consent doesn't include dissent. Well, yeah, it does, because there's a permit rule versus deny rule. And other people said, oh, consent in my only applies to certain regulated use cases. Well, we have to pick a name. So with consent, we picked consent, and with permission, we picked permission. But in scope of what permission should be able to communicate would include obligations. Indeed, it would include forbidden. So, the rule is really, permit, deny recursively with obligations.
And there is a really nice link in the FHIR consent as external link to called policy by, I think, or external policy, where you can reference to external policy language, which is a really nice way to separate, even dealing with complex issues such as delegations, what happens when you have multiple providers, how I pass delegation, what patient has agreed from one provider to another, but you need to formalize that. I know it's a really advanced version of consent, but it is something that we talked about that a while back, a couple of years ago, for the 7. So thanks for that, just a point.
Okay, so we're running out of time. So the last question to all the speakers and other leaders of community. Can you say what working groups exist, how to join these working groups, or at least discussions around like different IGs and specs? So maybe we can start from John.
So the HL7 security work group is where the security resources within FHIR are happening. We have a subgroup that meets every other week that is working on developing permission. So that's an HL7 work group. And then over in IHE, the IT infrastructure committee domain within IHE, I'm co-chair there as well. That is where we get PCF from and basic audit log patterns. So they do the security and privacy reusable implementation guides.
And what principle is applied that some projects are behind HL7 and behind IT?
Well, it used to be a lot more clear. HL7 did standards and IHE did profiling. It's less clear nowadays, but for the most part, I'm seeing mostly, well, obviously IHE is a profiling organization. So IHE is a place to create implementation guides. The advantage that they have over current vision in HL7 is that they can choose from any standard. So they're not limited to profiling FHIR. So that's why we have things like XDS and XCA within IHE, because we looked around at the standards available and found that EB registry was the best standard at that time to profile for that use case. So that's the benefit of IHE, is that it is a profiling organization. It will not create standards, but it's a profiling organization that can pull from any standards organization. So we pull from OASIS, W3C, HL7, DIC. So I just see that as a better place for implementation guides.
Okay. And definitely people can find you in a Zulip chat, yes? So there's stream for and ask any questions.
I love getting questions via email. I really warning, if you ask me a really great question, I'll probably move it into a blog article protecting you, but just because it's where I find reusable stuff. Yep.
Thank you. And Josh, can you tell a little bit more this SMART, because it consists now a lot of parts?
Yeah, so the app launch guide, where we define those scopes and the connection between apps and EHRs, that is work that happens in the FHIR infrastructure work group in HL7. And then there's a SMART channel on the Zulip site. And for Smart Health Links, similar story. It's work that is being taken into HL7 through the FHIR infrastructure work group. And there's also a health links channel or health cards and links channel on Zulip, which is the right place for community discussion on that.
Thank you. Do we have other projects? Mohammed,
So I wanted to mention, I think outside of the security working group, the CBCP working group is also then in the FAST group. There's an IG work group now to work on a consent management, which is all the aspect of consent outside of the enforcement of the consent and the decision making, basically. So I think there is some interesting work that's going to take place there. And then Sequoia also has recently started a consent and privacy work group. There's been a couple of meetings. I've attended those as well. And I think that's another venue where some of these conversations are happening.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting. Take care.